Every vacation begins the same way. A drive to someplace new, a week of unfamiliar routines. Then, before long, suitcases are packed, the keys are returned, and life quietly resumes where it left off. It's a rhythm so ordinary that most of us never think about it at all. We simply trust that every place we visit is, eventually, a place we'll leave. Bob and Kathy did too. For more than 20 years, the last week of July belonged to the coast. They never rented the same cottage twice. Not because they had bad experiences, but because discovering someplace new had become part of the vacation itself. Each summer brought another stretch of shoreline, another quiet neighborhood, another view from a different porch. Preparing for the trip had become just as familiar. A few days before they left, the suitcases came down from the closet. Beach towels were washed and folded. Clothes gathered on the guest room bed, while paperbacks, sunscreen, and little things that always seemed to be forgotten slowly collected beside the luggage. Bob handled the heavier jobs. He checked the tire pressure, topped off the gas tank that evening before they left, and packed the trunk with the same quiet patience he brought to everything else. Kathy made one last walk through the house, locking windows, adjusting the thermostat, watering the plants, and unplugging the coffee maker before pausing briefly at the kitchen counter. By Saturday morning, they were ready. Travel mugs of coffee rested in the cup holders as Bob locked the front door behind him. Out of habit, he gave the doorknob one quick tug before slipping the keys into his pocket. A few minutes later, they were on the road. The familiar highway gradually gave way to smaller roads lined with old farm stands, weathered fences, and stretches of open marsh where the tall grass bent in the breeze. Traffic thinned, the towns grew quieter. Then, as it always seemed to, the air changed. The faint scent of salt drifted through the open windows long before the ocean came into view. Neither of them ever knew exactly where it happened. The map guided them on a narrow road, then another. Finally, the pavement gave way to packed sand. Ahead of them sat a small cul-de-sac with only a handful of cottages gathered at its end. Theirs was the last one. Beyond it, a narrow footpath disappeared into the dunes. Somewhere beyond the tall beach grass, the ocean waited. Bob eased the car into the driveway and switched off the engine. For a moment, neither of them reached for the doors. There was always a brief pause at the beginning of every vacation, a quiet moment where work still felt close enough to touch and the week ahead didn't feel quite real. Bob finally reached for the keys. Together they stepped out into what they believed would be another ordinary week by the sea. The first morning at the cottage felt strangely familiar. Not in the comforting way a favorite vacation sometimes does. Something quieter than that. As though the morning had already happened once before. Bob couldn't have explained why the thought crossed his mind. By the time he stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, it had already begun to fade. The air was warm. Seagulls drifted overhead. Beyond the dunes, waves rolled steadily onto the shore, hidden from view but easy to hear. For a few minutes, he simply stood there, enjoying the silence. It wasn't until he finished half of his coffee that he happened to glance at his watch. 8:14. He looked up at the sun, then back at his watch. For some reason, he'd been certain it was much later. Not by hours, just later than it was. The kind of feeling everyone has from time to time after sleeping in somewhere unfamiliar. He turned the watch over, pressing one of the buttons without really knowing why, then slipped it back onto his wrist. Vacation had a way of throwing off your sense of time. He thought nothing more of it. A few minutes later, Kathy joined him on the porch, and before long they were on their way to the beach. The narrow path to the dunes was quiet except for a breeze moving through the tall grass. They passed another couple returning from an early walk, exchanged a polite smile, and continued toward to the shoreline. When the beach finally opened before them, it almost looked untouched. The tide was well out. Only a handful of people were scattered along the water, leaving long stretches of empty sand between them. Bob slipped off his shoes. The sand was already warm beneath his feet. They spent most of the morning doing very little, walking near the water, stopping whenever an interesting shell caught Kathy's attention. By early afternoon, they wandered into town for lunch before picking up a few groceries for the week. Fruits, dinners, crackers, etc. As they walked back toward the cottage, Bob finished his last cup of coffee and dropped the empty cup into a trash barrel outside of the small shops. Back at the cottage, Kathy began putting groceries away while Bob carried the last few bags inside. As he reached into the passenger seat, something caught his attention. The empty coffee cup still rested in the cup holder. He stopped for a second. He was sure he'd thrown it away. He remembered dropping it into the trash barrel in town. He picked up the cup and turned it over in his hand. It was the same cup, the same lid. Even the small coffee stain running down one side was exactly where he remembered it. Without saying anything, he carried it into the kitchen and dropped it into the trash. This time, he watched it fall to the bottom of the bin before closing the cabinet beneath the sink. By the time he turned away, he'd already begun wondering if he'd somehow imagined throwing it away the first time. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window while Rob measured coffee in the machine. Kathy stood at the counter flipping through the folded brochure they'd picked up from the rental office. For a while, everything felt normal again. Bob found himself wondering if he'd just been overthinking things. Vacations had a way of disrupting ordinary routines. Sleeping in unfamiliar beds, eating at different hours, spending entire days outside in the sun. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe the strange feeling he'd carried since arriving had nothing to do with the cottage at all. He didn't mention it. By the time they finished breakfast, the uneasiness had faded quietly into the background. "Beach first?" Kathy asked. Bob smiled. "Of course." They followed the sandy path behind the cottage, just as they had the previous morning. The weather hadn't changed, neither had the path. The same weathered fence post leaned slightly against the dunes. The same seagrass swayed in the breeze. Even the footprints left behind by yesterday's visitors had mostly disappeared beneath the night's wind. Halfway there, Bob slowed. Not because he was tired, because the beach still wasn't there. He looked ahead. The crest of the dunes felt farther away than he had remembered. Only slightly, the sort of difference nobody could measure. He kept walking without saying anything. A few moments later, they reached the sand exactly as expected. He glanced back toward the cottage. The walk hadn't taken that long. It only felt that it should have. By lunchtime, they decided to drive into town. The streets were busy. Families wandered between small shops while bicycles rolled slowly past the storefronts. The smell of fried seafood drifted across the sidewalks. They stopped at the grocery store for a few things they'd forgotten. Inside, Bob slowed the cart near one of the aisles. He paused momentarily. "We already bought crackers," he said. Kathy looked over. "No, we didn't." "I'm pretty sure we did." She smiled. "I think we'd remember buying crackers." Bob stared at the shelf for another second before reaching for a box. "Maybe." He dropped them into the cart. A while later, they walked down the street toward a small clam shack with a line stretching nearly to the parking lot. When it was finally Bob's turn to order, the older man behind the window looked up and smiled. "Back so soon?" Bob hesitated a moment. "I'm sorry?" The man blinked. "I thought you were here earlier." Bob smiled politely. "Nope, first time," Bob said. For another second, the man looked at him. Then he laughed quietly. "My mistake." He handed Bob his receipt. "Summer gets busy," he said. "Faces start blending together." Bob thanked him and stepped aside. Kathy shrugged. "I guess you got one of those faces." "I guess," he said. The conversation ended there. It should have. But as they carried their food toward one of the picnic tables overlooking the harbor, Bob found himself looking back at the stand. The man was already serving someone else. He didn't look confused anymore. He looked as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The drive back to the cottage was quiet. Bob kept one hand resting on the steering wheel while the other hung loosely against the open window. A few miles outside of town, something caught his attention. The small white church they'd passed yesterday appeared sooner than he expected. He distinctly remembered it sitting farther down the road. Not by much, just a little farther that he remembered. He looked into the rearview mirror after they passed it. For a moment he considered saying something. Instead, he convinced himself he simply hadn't paid close enough attention the day before. The afternoon settled into silence. Kathy stretched out in the porch with a novel. Bob carried a chair into the shade and opened the mystery he'd brought from home. He found himself checking his watch every few pages. Sometimes it seemed as though 20 minutes had disappeared. Other times he was surprised to find 5 had barely passed. The feeling was impossible to explain. Time wasn't moving strangely. His sense of it was. Late in the afternoon, he closed the book altogether. He wasn't tired, he just couldn't concentrate. Across the porch, Kathy lowered her novel onto her lap. "You done reading?" she asked. "I think so." She smiled. "Me too." For the first time since arriving, they spent the rest of the afternoon just sitting together, watching the breeze move through the dune grass. That evening, they walked down to the beach one last time before dinner. The shoreline was nearly empty now. A few distant figures wandered near the water, but otherwise the beach belonged to the gulls and the steady rhythm of the waves. It should have been peaceful. Instead, Bob couldn't shake the feeling that something was quietly out of place. Nothing he could point to, nothing he could explain. Only a persistent thought that refused to leave him alone. When they finally turned back toward the cottage, he looked once more at the narrow path climbing through the dunes. He couldn't have said why, but for the first time since arriving, he found himself wondering whether the walk back had always been that long. The next morning felt different. Neither of them said it, but breakfast was quieter than it had been since they arrived. Bob caught Kathy staring out the window more than once. She noticed him doing the same. Neither of them commented on it. After cleaning up, they decided to drive into town again. Neither seemed particularly eager to go. Halfway there, Bob glanced toward a small white church they'd pass each day. "I thought it was farther back." Kathy looked over. "No, it wasn't." Bob kept his eyes on the road. "I know." A few seconds passed before he added, "At least, I don't think it was." Neither of them said anything after that. The town felt unusually busy, not crowded. It was just harder to follow. Bob checked his watch twice before realizing they hadn't even been there a half hour. He would have guessed they'd spent most of the afternoon walking. Neither of them could seem to settle on anything. They wandered through a few shops without buying anything, then found themselves heading back toward the car much earlier than they had planned. The drive back was quiet. About halfway to the cottage, Kathy continued looking out the passenger window. "Does this drive seem longer today?" Bob glanced at her. "You noticed it too?" She nodded. "I thought maybe I was imagining it." Neither of them laughed. The silence that followed felt strangely comforting. For the first time since arriving, Bob wasn't carrying that feeling by himself. That afternoon they stayed at the cottage. Neither suggested walking to the beach. Neither picked up the books they'd brought from home. Instead, they sat together on the porch, watching breeze move through the grass. After a long while, Kathy finally spoke. "I keep feeling we've been here longer than we have." Bob looked over. "I know." It was the first time either of them admitted something wasn't right. As evening settled over the cottages, Bob stood and looked toward the narrow path disappearing into the dunes. For a moment, he considered walking down to the beach. Then he quietly changed his mind. Not because he was tired. It was for reasons he couldn't explain. The walk suddenly felt much farther than it should have. He turned back toward Kathy. "I think we should head home tomorrow." She answered almost immediately. "I was hoping you would say that." Bob woke before sunrise. The decision had already been made. Neither of them talked about staying another day. They packed quietly. The refrigerator was emptied. The trash was taken out. Suitcases were zipped and carried to the car one by one. Before closing the front door, Bob walked through the cottage one last time. Every room looked exactly as it had when they arrived. For a moment, he stood in the living room listening to the silence. Then he stepped outside and locked the door behind him. Kathy dropped the key in the lockbox. "Ready?" she asked. Bob looked toward the dunes one last time. "I am." The car rolled slowly through the sandy cul-de-sac before reaching the main road. Almost immediately, Bob felt something he hadn't felt in days. Relief. The farther they drove, the lighter everything seemed. Beside him, Kathy leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. For the first time all week, neither of them felt the need to talk. Bob found himself replaying the vacation instead. The strange feeling that had started on the first morning, the beach path that never seemed quite the same length twice, the man at the seafood stand, the long drives that somehow felt longer every day. He shook his head. Maybe they just needed to get away. Maybe once they were home, everything would make sense again. A weathered mailbox slipped past the passenger window. Something about it felt familiar. He thought for a moment before dismissing it. Another gentle bend in the road. A split rail fence. Again, familiar. His smile faded. Did I miss a turn, he thought? He hadn't been paying much attention to the road. He'd spent the last several miles lost in thought. He slowed slightly, then the road curved one final time. Sand drifted across the pavement. A circle of cottages came into view. Bob's hand tightened around the steering wheel. At the very end of the cul-de-sac stood the same cottage. exactly where they'd left it. Kathy opened her eyes. What is it? Bob didn't answer immediately. I think... He stared through the windshield. I think I took a wrong turn. She looked out at the cottage. Neither of them spoke. Bob shifted the car into reverse. Without another word, he turned around and drove back toward the main road. This time he paid attention. Every intersection, every curve, every road sign. The vacation no longer mattered. Only the road did. There was no reason they should end up back there again. Several quiet minutes passed, and neither of them spoke, and then... Another weathered mailbox. Bob sat up straighter. No, he thought. A split-rail fence. The same gentle bend. His foot slowly lifted from the accelerator. Sand drifted across the road. The circle of cottages appeared once more. The same cottage waited at the end of the cul-de-sac. Neither of them said a word. Bob brought the car to a stop. The engine continued to idle. Kathy stared through the windshield. Finally, almost in a whisper, she asked, "How did we get back here?" Bob never answered. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The engine idled quietly while the cottage sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, exactly where it had been when they left. Nothing about it looked unusual. The windows reflected the afternoon sun. The dune grass swayed gently in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the cottages, waves rolled steadily onto the shore. Bob stared through the windshield. I don't understand. It was all he could manage to say. Kathy remained silent. After a while, Bob shifted the car into drive. This time I'm not taking my eyes off the road. He pulled away slowly. Every bit of his attention stayed fixed on the road ahead. Every road sign, every mailbox, every intersection. He memorized every turn, refusing to let his attention wander the way he believed it had before. Several quiet minutes passed. Then again, Bob saw the same weathered mailbox. His stomach tightened. The split-rail fence appeared a few seconds later. The road curved gently to the right. Sand drifted across the pavement. The circle of cottages came into view, and at the very end stood the same cottage. Bob eased the car to a stop now. Neither said a word. For a long moment, the only sound was the engine idling between them. Finally, Kathy looked over. We didn't turn around? Bob slowly shook his head. No, we didn't miss anything. Again, he shook his head in disbelief. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of them could have said. Bob reached forward and turned off the engine. Neither of them moved. The afternoon breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the smell of salt and warm sand. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the waves continued breaking against the shore, as though nothing at all had happened. After another long moment, Bob opened the driver's door. Kathy stepped out without a word. She crossed the yard, opened the lockbox, removed the key, and unlocked the front door. Bob watched her for a second before walking to the trunk. Together they carried the suitcases back inside. The cottage hadn't changed. The beds were still made. The coffee mugs still rested beside the sink exactly where they'd left them before they drove away. Nothing suggested they'd ever been gone. Kathy quietly closed the front door. The latch clicked. Neither of them spoke. Bob set his suitcase beside the front door. Not in the bedroom. Not against the wall. Right beside the door. He never unpacked. As evening settled over the beach, he lowered himself into the chair facing the front window. Outside, the road disappeared between the dunes exactly as it had on the day they arrived. It looked no different. It still looked like a road that led home. Bob watched it until the darkness made it impossible to see where it went.